I am back.
Alrighty.
Sorry about that. I was trying to get the video to work, but no dice.
Okay.
Okay.
So we're doing part 3 now?
Yep, we are doing part 3. So part 3 is going to be much like part 1. So part 3 is about pedestrian infrastructure. And this is where we see a lot of the petty stuff. So in the first part was more of the major works like moving poles around and changing poles. This is the more of their petty things that they do every summer. So I'm going to start off with changing pedestrian heads. Those are also known as displays. So to give an example here, this is the older generation heads were incandescent. They were double sized. They had the hand and the walks were in different halves of the head. Then probably late 90s, I would guess, is when they started converting to these LED ones, where they're also known as bimodal, where the hand and the walk are actually in the same lens. And this is a first generation of the LEDs. You can see that there's the 2 pipe mount brackets. So that's how these original ones were mounted, was a pipe above and a pipe below. Starting in later years, the city began to change these heads. So looking over here on this side of the corner, for example, you can see that in 2009, it is the first generation LED. Now, they started changing to using a different mounting bracket in 2009. It was a square bracket that held the head from above, and there was no bottom support to it. So this is 2009 before they did the change. And you can see here that this is the 2 pipe mount.
Chris, you're not sharing your display, sir.
Oh, thank you. Okay, can you hear me? You got my display?
Yes.
Sorry, that was a mistake on my part. Okay, so this is the first generation LED head that has the 2 pipe mount. And then around 2010 to 2011, the same pole's still here, but you can see they've changed the mounts now to having these square brackets above. These square brackets were used from 2009 to 2015, and then starting in 2016, they went back to the 2 pipes. So that was it in 20 before up to 2015, and here we are back to the 2 pipes. So to refresh, 09, we have the 2 pipes. Now, what they were doing is I was showing how they were changing all these heads out to get rid of the duplicity for the left turns. And it seems that when they did that, in this case, when they took that head out, they also changed the pedestrian heads. And they do this very commonly. So you can see now the heads are changed to having the square bracket. And then in later years, when they were working again, they changed back, they converted back to the pipes. So the pattern, the highlight here to take away from this is it represents this pattern of back and forth that we're seeing, where they started off with 2 pipes, then they went to the square brackets, then they went back to the 2 pipes. And every time they worked on anything in between, they were continually changing them. So to use this one as an example, you can see here 2 pipes. Then this particular one is changed to the square. And then it was turned, and you can see it's back to the 2 pipes. And there was this constant pattern of changing. So I just had a few examples here. And this one was particularly good because here's the first generation that I was talking about, the extra large heads that are incandescent. This pole was changed, I believe, in late 2015. So here it is in July of 15. You can see it's still the incandescent. And then in 2016, it's now got the change to LED with the 2 square brackets holding it on the top from just above. Then in 2017, it's now got the 2 pipes. And then in 2018, they put in the countdowns. So you can see that these heads only survived for a 1 year time span. And my argument has been all along that they should have been using putting in the countdowns if they were going to be changing the heads. And it's this constant pattern we see of changing heads whenever they're doing work at an intersection. So again, here's another case where there's the older incandescent head. Then it's changed to the one with the single mount bracket above, the one they were using from 2009 to 15, and then they changed the pole, and instead of moving the head over, changed it again, and now it's got the 2 pipes. And again, it represents this pattern where head changing is being done independently of pole changing. So we see these cases where heads are going up on an old pole, and then they only survive for a year. And then when the poles change, they change the head again because they're changing their preferred styles so often that basically anything in the city will almost always be out of date. And this is the same corner I showed earlier where they did the same thing on the other sides too. So you can see there's the single head, had the incandescent, and it's on a citywide basis that you see these patterns. And again, there's the left turn heads; those were changed back when they had all of the left turns. So again, it's just the same pattern on a citywide basis. And now the department's answer for this. I have asked the department about this. Why are they changing all of these heads that are not that old? And their answer is that they're putting in that it was because when they put the APS systems in. So, but what I have to say that is, if that was what they were doing, if it was because of the APS systems, you see the heads have a chip in them, that there's a soundboard in them for the APS, but that's not the only time they're changing the heads. So that doesn't explain it. For example, here you can see this is a first generation LED head. It's got the 2 pipes above and below. And 2016, they changed it, and now it's the later generation one. It's still got the 2 pipes, because they'd already gone full circle by that point. Versus when you look at it though, you can see it already had an APS system here. There was already these gray APS units. These heads already had soundboards in them. So there was no reason to have to change the heads when they converted to the yellow APS, which I'll talk about a bit later. You can see this one started off with the 2 pipes, went to the square bracket, swapped the sides of the pole, and then went back to the 2 pipes. And this whole time, the intersection had APS, so there was no reason to be changing those heads. But yet we saw this on a mass citywide basis. And another example here on Corden, you can see they're already LED heads. They came in 2014 and changed these APS units. And again, changed all the heads to the ones with the single point brackets. So you can see these poles didn't move any. You can see there's the older 2 pipe mount bracket. They came in 14 and took the head off this pole, moved it here, and changed it to the single point mount. And yet APS was there the whole time. This intersection always had the APS. And normally, even when they were converting to APS, they were changing all the heads. So the department said, well, in that case, when they were adding APS, they had to change the heads because these older heads didn't have soundboards in them. But again, there's the odd exception. So here's a case where they added APS, in this case in 2013, but this was the one anomaly where the same head actually got reused. It got turned, but it stayed on the same pole. And that tells us right there that they didn't have to change the heads, that this was this excuse, just a reason, simply it doesn't hold up when you look at what was happening on the roads, because while this intersection had the older generation of the 2 pipe mount brackets, when it got changed to add APS, all the heads were changed except for that one, and they were turned, which I'll talk about in a minute. So that doesn't hold up. Now, even if that were true, looking at this intersection here, even if they had to change all the heads with soundboards, This intersection here does not have APS system, which is what makes that auditory sound for visually impaired people. There's the APS system, and then there is the countdowns. And these two projects the city had actually overlaid with each other, where they were putting in the countdowns and the APS at the same time. The APS system conversion or installation started in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then they started around 2013 putting in the countdowns. And so and both projects concluded around 2020. So for that 7-year time span, the two projects were overlaying. Now, here is the intersection of Arlington and William, and you can see it's already got the LED heads on all 4 corners. You can see there's the first generation and second generation. It's a mixture. You can see this is the first generation of the 2 pipes. And this is the second generation because from a pole change with the single square bracket. And I believe there was another one here. I believe that's it there. So this intersection already had LED heads at it. In 2017, the city added the auditory pedestrian signals, APS system. So here it is now in 2017. You can see that there's the yellow APS units added, but they changed all of the heads. They also turned these particular ones sideways. So you can see now the heads are all changed. They're slightly darker black. They've got a slightly different shape to them. So this was done in 17. And then a year later, the department went back and put in the countdowns. So this is extremely inefficient. There's no reason why the department shouldn't have been putting in these countdowns at the same time as the APS. Why would they go in 2017, put in an APS system, change every head at the intersection, only to go back a year later and then put in the countdowns? They were already putting in countdowns at that time. And that is far from being an exception. Here's an intersection in 2016 that had the older incandescent heads. APS was added. There's the yellow APS. The head was taken off this pole and moved over there. And you can see they changed out the incandescent units. Again, we'll go back. You can see the larger incandescent units. So the incandescent units were changed out. Because this was post 2015, they were back to using the 2 pipe assembly. And then they just went back later, a year later, again, and then put in the countdowns. Again, no reason why those countdowns shouldn't have just been put in before. And interesting over here, we actually have a case of a redundant pole. So it's kind of overlapping with the first presentation. You can see they had a separate pole here holding just this pedestrian head. And in 2017, they abandoned the pole and moved it over. So that's just a little bit of a rehash from round 1. And this is what we're seeing on a citywide basis. So again, just another example. Here is Corden and Daly Street North. You can see that it is already got incandescent heads. This is 2016. In 2017, they went and put the heads together and changed all of the heads when they added the APS, just to go back in 18 and change them to pedestrian countdowns. And in a lot of cases, there were intersections where they were doing the countdowns at the same time. So you can see here, this is 2016. You can see there's no APS or countdowns. So then we go to 2017. Now we've got APS, but no countdowns, and all the heads changed. And then in 2018, then they go back and put in the countdowns. Again, they should have just done it all together. And to show that they were clearly putting in the countdowns at this time, if we go up to the intersection of Corden and Lilac, if you recall that they changed those heads in around 2017, Corden and Lilac right here we are in 15, this intersection already had APS. There's the APS right there. You can see it's the older gray boxes, which I'll talk about in a bit. They changed the heads when they put that APS in. And then they went back in 16 and then put in the countdowns. So basically what we're seeing here is this pattern of where Corden and Lilac already had older APS. They come along in 16 and then put in the countdowns. And then Corden and Daly, which didn't have anything, they put in the APS in 17 and then come back in 18 to put in the countdowns. They should have just done it all together. It's this extremely inefficient practices we're seeing. Now, as another example, This is the intersection of St. James and Ellis. They started putting in countdowns in 2013. This intersection was the street renewal in 2015. So here you can see it's all being rebuilt. This looks awfully familiar. The two left turn heads. I'm sure we'll notice here in October 5th, by October 15, it's gone. But the point I'm making is this construction was all wrapped up now by 16. And you can see, so this was rebuilt in 15 and 16. They didn't put in countdowns. But yet the city started putting in countdowns in 2013. So it's this extremely inefficient practice of rebuilding an intersection in 2015, a major intersection, not putting in the countdowns during the rebuild, putting up the older style heads in 15, 16, just to have to go back later and then put in the countdowns. Whenever they were doing rebuilds and renewals, they should have been putting in the countdowns right from the start of that phase in. And then here's the opposite we see. Here's Maryland and Portage. Here it is in 2012. You can see it's the old incandescent heads. They come along in 2014, and you can see now they're in the process of installing the countdowns. You can see the countdown portion is not activated yet. It's still hooded. They activated it in 15 just to tear it all up. The same. So 14, they install the countdowns just to come in 15 and tear the whole intersection up. And you can see there's our pattern of pole moving a couple feet. And we talked about this intersection in the first part of the presentation, but they took an intersection that was about to get completely rebuilt, went in there a year ahead of the rebuild and put in all the countdowns just to then rebuild it, take out the countdowns they just put in. And then meanwhile, at the exact same time, and also in 2015, we have an intersection that doesn't yet have countdowns. They rebuild it and don't put in the countdowns. It's, again, this pattern of doing all these things as separate projects, which then maximizes the work, putting in the APS, putting in the countdowns, rebuilding the streets. All these things are done, or changing heads, then changing poles. All these things are done separately, creating maximum inefficiency and maximum waste. And just another example of the same thing. This is Corden and Pembina Highway. You can see we've got our newer LED heads, but we don't have an APS system yet. They came in 2015 and put in the APS system and the countdowns. So this one is in 2015. This is one that they seemingly are doing it efficiently, where they're actually putting in the countdowns and the APS together. Yet they only did it a year ahead of completely rebuilding the whole intersection. And there it is, being all torn up and poles all being moved just a year after they had outfitted it with APS and countdowns. Again, they should have just waited a year and put it in then. And during this time, the majority of intersections didn't yet have APS or countdowns. So why would they not put in the APS and countdowns that intersections are not about to rebuild, and then put it in when they do the rebuild? So it's a double-sided coin here. And that also involves brand new builds, not just rebuilds or renewals. Here's an intersection that was a brand new build in 2015. We go back here to July of 14, and there is no sign of this intersection at all. This is the new Walmart they built in Taylor Avenue. You can see it's just in July of 2014, it's just an open field. Here we are in the spring of 15, and it's a brand new build with cantilevers. And in 2015, they were well into their project of installing countdowns, which had been going on since 13, and no countdowns. And we have to bounce up to later. They have to come back and put in the countdowns. So again, just extremely inefficient practices. Now, this is kind of related to the practice I talked about in part 1 with the redundant pole installations. We also see this pattern of pedestrian heads being combined, split, recombined. So, and a lot of this tied to APS installation. And now the theory I have is that they were basically given a blank check to do the APS installations. So I suspect that that work was padded by doing all of this head moving and rewiring that otherwise just wasn't necessary. So to use this as an example, this is Arlington and Portage, the southwest corner, and you can see here that these pedestrian heads are facing forwards.
Chris,
yes?
I see Councillor Eadie's little dots going.
Oh, sure.
I know
Councillor
that
Eadie?
he may have challenges trying to do typing. Councillor Eadie, did you have a question? That could just be something he's accidentally hid. Councillor Eady, if you do have a question, just chime in when you have an opportunity. Sorry, Chris, continue.
No problem. I can't see the chat, so if anyone wants to interrupt me, that's the only way to get my attention.
Yeah, I'm watching the chat and your presentation.
Okay, thank you. So going back at this intersection, this is Arlington and Portage. And you can see here these pedestrian heads are both facing, this one's facing forwards. Now we have, referring back to part 1, we have this redundant pole. They come along in 2013-ish and add the auditory pedestrian signal. You can see these gray, here they are right here, they're gray boxes. They took the head off the redundant pole and they changed the heads. You can see when we go back here to 12, you can see that the head is on the 2-pipe mount bracket. They change it from the 2-pipe mount to the single pipe mount, take the head off this redundant pole and they consolidate them onto this standard, proving that this was a redundant pole all along, which is kind of refreshing from part 1. And then we go up to later years, and in 2015 they do a street renewal. They took out the redundant pole they'd abandoned in 2013 just to install a brand new redundant pole and resplit the heads. And here we are now in 2016 with the heads split up again, except they're facing sideways from how they originally were, with a redundant pole placed very close to this davit that could have continued holding both heads.
Okay. Councillor Eady did have a comment. He said inefficient, yes, but separate signal programs with different priority intersections. Priority often changes based on council member demand. So to align all programs, some intersections will have to change priority.
Yes, and that's true, and I considered that in my research, and that was actually the exact reason that I made the point of highlighting the contrast between Daly Street and Lilac Street versus Corden. Because in both of those cases, Daly Street and Lilac Street are side roads and Corden is the regional, and they're both going through the same neighborhood. They're both streets that are intersections that are like one after each other along Corden. So the intersections are very comparable. It's not like comparing, Portage and Gary versus a little residential like Springfield and Rothesay. Well, Springfield and Rothesay is much lower or intersections closer to schools versus ones that aren't. So Chris, I did consider that in my research. That's why I was highlighting those two intersections, which are in the same proximity to each other. Neither of them are at a school. They're both in the same area, the same commercial area. So I did consider those priorities.
I have a few more. That's okay. The priorities for audible pedestrian signals, I was there when it was established right in the beginning back in the 90s. And then there was a bunch of changes. So I do have a couple of questions because you're hearing about soundboards. Well, so when they started the audible signal thing, they decided they didn't want to bring the sound down to the pedestrian level, which was stupid. They wouldn't listen to the sound experts like myself, who navigate the streets every day. Now, so they had to change things as a result of their stupidity and not listening. They had to do studies, like you're saying with the pedestrian corridors thing. But you mentioned one thing that was interesting to me. You're saying that they have soundboards up in the signal heads?
Yes, the soundboard doesn't make the sound though. The speaker makes the sound. What you're referring to from the mid-90s was the old little square box speakers. Those were mounted up adjacent to the pedestrian heads. I'll actually be talking about those in a little bit.
They had to replace those because it was a stupid thing to do. So,
versus the versus the APS little square boxes.
I just want to get into you. Okay, you have an idea what priority is. But I'll tell you, when it came to the audible signals, the reason Lilac got an audible signal very early on is at Lilac, there used to be MTS building there, and there was somebody who was blind who worked in there. And it was one of the first ones that got audible pedestrian signals, okay? long time ago, way before they were doing anything with daily, right? So I'm just trying to point out, there needs to be better coordination. But remember, what you think, like, I get calls all the time for priority places to put in the countdown signals, right? So I get those all the time. And, you know, I'm trying to represent my residents. So, you know, if you can get them to change it, and often the committee, IRPW, will get presented a different priority, or somebody has a priority for a pedestrian corridor. And as I said to my colleagues, when you were talking about the pedestrian corridor at Church and Salter, that was a waste of money. There's a fully signalized intersection at McRae and Salter, right on the other side of the school. So so I'm just saying, Chris. Yeah. You have an idea of priority. Everybody's got their own ideas what's priority and what isn't priority. So how do you coordinate that? So give me a solution, Chris.
The solution I say, though, is we shouldn't be inefficient. So we already know we're putting in pedestrian countdowns. So what I'm saying is if we're going to put an APS system, I wasn't disputing how soon Lilac and Corden got APS. It wasn't really one of the earlier ones. I believe it was around 2013 it got it. It never had those overhead speakers. But the issue that I'm making isn't the priority of which intersections got before others. It's the inefficiency of putting an APS system.
So you have to align the priority for all of the different programs together to get rid of that efficiency.
Well, in this case,
that's
though,
what I'm saying. Yeah. I'm not blaming our staff. Like,
what I'm saying, though, is that
they're told what's priority and what isn't priority, right?
Well, what I'm saying is that when you put in an APS system and you change every single head, it's just as much effort to have put in countdown heads as it is to have put in regular heads when you're already changing every single signal head. So it's better to have, if you're changing every head, change every head and put in countdowns. Don't come back a year later to do it.
So each program only has X amount of dollars, right? So again, they have a priority for the countdown signals, which doesn't coordinate with other work they're doing. That's all I'm saying, Chris. Yeah. So it's really what it is, you know, if there's priority to do work, then all the programs have to line up. That's the problem.
Oh, I would agree. Can
we keep going?
Yeah.
Sure. Just to be cognizant of the fact, Councillor, that, you know, if they know they're already redoing a street next year and they're going to be redoing the signals in the following year, why would they go in and do the pedestrian or the audible signals a year before they're about to redo everything?
And my other point is when you do redo everything, why would you put in outdated infrastructure being on countdown heads just to come back and change them?
So, Councillor Brawadi, the audible signals program was a human rights complaint. And they had to get the work done in a certain period of time, and it took them 23 years, right? The original plan was 50 years, actually. But anyway, just anyway, all right.
Yeah. Just one last comment. The soundboards I was referring to don't actually make the sound. I know what you're referring to about the speakers higher up versus the boxes further down, but the soundboards in the heads are actually got nothing to do with the location of the speaker. The speaker is what makes the sound. The soundboard is the controller.
Thank you.
Okay. Continuing. So when they were putting in APS systems and they were continually changing these head configurations. So to give an example here, you can see Councillor Eadie just spoke about these. These are the older APS units up higher up by the pedestrian head. But independent of that, you can see that these heads are facing forwards. Like this one's facing the same direction as the vehicle head, and this one is on a separate pole. Now, in later years, you can see they came along and they changed them to LED ones and didn't put in countdowns, but that's okay because we're still in the pre-countdown era. But you can see they're now flipped sideways. This one's overall, this one was facing this way, and this one was facing the opposite, adjacent. So to go back, you can see, you see how these are facing forwards. Now they're flipped sideways. Then they consolidated them and changed them again. Then they put in the countdowns, and now they're consolidated. So it's this constant moving around of heads that we're seeing. To use another example, Burroughs and McGregor, you can see that these two heads are consolidated on the same pole, and now they're split again. And then when they came back and put in the cantilevers a year later, they're back to being consolidated, but back to one pole. So it's this constant flipping the head sideways. And what I would argue is that this moving around of heads actually shows the fluidity of where you can actually put the heads, the fact that they'll move them and then move them right back where they started. It proves that it's not an improvement when you move it back to how it originally started, which in many cases proves the redundancy of a lot of these poles. Now, here's another example of these heads are split. This is 2007. They were changed around 2008. So you can see it jumped the sides of the pole there. And then later, completely left this pole and moved over to this one. Here's Cordon and Stafford. This is the southwest side of the corner. You can see these heads are facing forwards. This is 2012. Then when they converted to countdowns, my argument is that when you put in the countdowns, you can easily just put the countdown head here in the same position as the earlier heads were, but they didn't. They took the head out and combined them and did a consolidation and put them over here onto one pole. So this was done in 14. Here they are now in service in 15. And then they came back again. Poles are never changed positions, split them again, but now they're facing sideways from how they were originally. So to rehash, facing forwards, consolidated onto the davit, back to being split again. In this case, this changing was only 2 years apart. So here you can see the countdowns are put in, they're facing forwards, jump up. They took the head off of this davit, put it over here onto the shaft pole, the new shaft pole when they moved it up. So now the heads are consolidated. So before they were split facing forwards, they put the countdowns in the same position. Then they moved this pole up and consolidated. Then they went back again and re-split them, except now they're turned sideways. And here's another one. You see facing forwards, and then when they put the countdown, and then they changed the heads and consolidated, only to come back again and then put in the countdowns. Again, when they're changing the heads, they should have just put in the countdowns. So that was the pattern of splitting and consolidating. The other pattern is this flipping thing. So here you can see the heads are facing forwards. Then in 2013, they put in the APS system as part of their standard practice. They changed the heads. So we reviewed this at the first part. You can see how they're on the 2 pipe brackets. They changed the heads. Now they're on the single point brackets, but now they're turned sideways. And then when they put the countdowns in, they flipped them back to how they were originally. Now they're back facing forwards. So again, it's this in, out that we're seeing. So there they are sideways. Now they're back to facing forwards. Now, here we go again. You can see facing forwards, flip sideways, move this one to the other side of the pole, back facing forwards again. And this is just a pattern all across the city. Now, I opened this presentation with saying it seems like chaos and mayhem. It's actually not. Here's another example. Just you can see the same pattern. This intersection already has APS. You can see these yellow boxes here. There's the APS system. So it's already there. So this whole soundboard argument simply doesn't support this work. Now they're changed. Now you can see they're on the 2 pipe brackets. Again, they should have just put in countdowns. And then they put in the countdowns. And they're back to original orientation facing forwards. Again, proving the redundancy of that pole. And it's just having the second pole just allows them to just keep moving these heads back and forth and changing their directions. And here is they're facing forwards. Now they're flipped sideways. Now they're consolidated. So that's kind of combining the patterns. Here they are facing forwards. They put in the APS in 2017, changed all the heads. Instead of putting in countdowns, they kept these normal LED heads, but now they're flipped sideways. So again, 16 forwards, 18 sideways, 21 they put in the countdowns, and they're back facing forwards. Now I've studied the whole city to give you an example of that. This is not a small task. Here is all the locations that I've tracked. I've done about 77% of the city. So starting here, each intersection, followed by which side of the corner, this is all their head flipping sideways. You see, this is not a small undertaking. Now these are the ones they flip back. These are the ones they change the sides of the pole on. So this isn't small. Now, I've traced the years. It seems that they were changing these heads sideways. The sideways head orientation started around 2011 and ceased around 2018. So up until 2011, all the heads were put facing forwards, like you see this one here. And then they were changed, and then they started changing them sideways around 2011, and they ceased in 2018. They still changed some sideways. So the broader pattern seems to be this reversal of however it's built, but overall their preference seems to have gone back to forwards facing. So we see this a lot with intersections such as, we'll just do a bit of a overview of an intersection as an example. So here is the intersection of McRae and Salter. Here it is in 2014. This is pre-APS and pre-countdown. You can see though that it was a newer intersection, so it's got all 12-inch lenses, and you can see that it's got LED heads. They added the APS and the countdowns in 2017, and you can see the new heads are flipped sideways. They're all flipped sideways. And then if you go back to as of this year, here's pictures I took, because Street View's not up to date. They did the street renewal in 2021, just this past summer, and there's the pedestrian head on the northeast side of the corner. Again, showing that here was changed sideways in 2017, and here it is in 2021 for facing forwards. And they didn't add APS, they didn't add countdowns. Those were already in place. This was just reversing it as part of a street renewal. And you can see they also changed these shaft poles to the ones that have the heads on the sides. So that's part of their pattern now, is anytime they do street renewals or work on intersections, they're reversing all of their earlier work that they did when they were putting in countdowns. All of this flipping the head sideways is now being undone. And again, you can see just as the proof of the redundant pole, here that's the head facing forwards, and we jump up a year, and now they're facing sideways, and they're changed right in the middle of while they're doing countdowns. They should have just put countdowns in, and there's no reason why they had to be flipping all these heads sideways. That was just a flavor of the year thing that seemed to last for about 8 years. And now, because of all of that, I want to show what they're doing. The forward orientation is actually the better way of doing things, because what it does is it puts them out of the way of vehicles. So you can see, if you go back here to back when this was forward orientation, you can see how the poles are actually shielding the heads. You can see the head is on the side of the pole here away from the traffic lane. When they turn the head sideways like this, any vehicles that cut this corner can scrape these heads off. And so they're just, by having flipped all these heads sideways as part of this 7-year project, That's all they were doing, was generating work for themselves. So here's an example. You can see vehicle sheared this head off. When you go back, far before the countdowns were put in, the heads were protected by the pole. But when they put them, when they do the when they turn them sideways, they're actually putting them in the path of turning vehicles. Sorry, wrong document. There's one that got hit so hard it was just spun sideways. You can see now this is also a road safety concern, because now the head's not even in service anymore because nobody can even see it. It's been spun, hit so hard it's turned, it's knocked sideways. When you go back before the countdowns were put in, you can see it originated on this pole over here, directly in line with the crosswalk and out of the way of vehicles, shielded by the pole. So now what they're doing is they're creating this hazard where the heads aren't even visible to pedestrians. You can see this one, they hadn't even taken the cover off and put it into service yet. It's already been hit and knocked sideways. And this is a very, very common problem. Here's one that's the top lens is just smashed right off of it. There's another one that's knocked. Both of these were hit. This one was facing that crosswalk, and this one was facing this crosswalk, and you can see both of them are hit completely, knocked completely sideways. There's one that got the lens smashed clean off it. See, it's all different kinds of damage, but there it is. And there are so many of them. And the reason I'm just hashing through these, you can see there's just so many, is to just kind of drive this point home that this isn't isolated cases. This is a problem that this department has created by knocking all of these heads sideways and putting them too close to traffic lanes. This was never something that they should have been doing. All they've done is generate unnecessary work for themselves by turning them all by flipping them sideways, and now they are continuously, this is my concluding and favorite one. You can see it just looks like somebody took a machete to it. And this is a self-created problem. And not to mention the damage it's probably done to vehicles. Now they're also continually changing the sides of the poles. So again, there's just no standards as to where these heads go on the pole. So you can see here, these are consolidated. And you saw that one was on the right. Now it's bumped over to the left side. So again, you're looking directly at it. You can see it's on the right side of the pole. They knocked it over to the left side. Now I would say, well, maybe it's because when a car turned, it scraped it off. They had to do that. Well, if that's the case, then when they came and put the countdown in, they put it right back to where it originated. And here's another one. You can see this one's on the right side of the pole. Now it's moved to the left side of the pole, only to be moved back to the right side. Back and forth. This one was done twice, and now these ones are pretty well shielded because the corner here is pretty wide, but you can see how they're both directly above the crosswalk they serve. Now they're both directly behind the poles. They had just been put in. And in the case of this corner, Burroughs and Keewatin again, they actually did this at 3 different sides of the intersection. So you can see here's the pole in the sidewalk. They dug the pole out and moved it. There's the pole off the sidewalk with the head on the left side of it. Only to then later come back and put the head on the right side of it and change it. And then come back again and flip them facing forwards. And same thing happening here. The head jump sides twice. Same here. You can see this head starts on the right side, goes to the left side, then comes back again, right where it started. There's so many of them. So that's the patterns we're seeing with this head placements. They're constantly moving heads. They're combining them. They're splitting them. They're turning them sideways. Some of it can be separated by year, but overall, it's just this constant in and out pattern of however it is, they're going to reverse it to something else. Now on to push buttons. Would anybody object if I took a 5-minute break? I just need like 2 minutes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, I'm back. I just need to grab some water. So moving on to push buttons, the same patterns that I talked about with respect to the head moving, it's also seen in push buttons. So I talked about this a little bit in part 2. So here is an intersection, a corridor. This is a pedestrian corridor. It's split into 2 halves. There's each side, and you can see the push buttons here are on 45-degree angles. Then they came and took them out. You can see the patches and stacked them. This is what they started doing around 2016. Then they came back in 2017, combined the 2 push buttons into one, changed the pole to this double davit. This is something I agree that they should be doing, but they converted it into one crosswalk, wired the whole thing to be one with this center button just resetting the count for the flashing period. And you can see these heads don't have the back facing lights because they're treating the whole thing as one. Then in 2018, when they went back to stacked, they had to come back. This crosswalk's only less than a year old, and they took the one button out. You can see here it is with the one button in 17, come back in 18, change the one button back to 2 stacked, and had to change all of these overhead lights. So you can see how it started off with just the one side light the lights facing one direction. Now they have to change them to back to back, which is how I'd say they should have done it all along. And it demonstrates this problem we have here where they don't actually have a set standard. They can't agree on a set standard. I've been asking through FIPA for years what their standard is for these things, and they say it's coordinated through word of mouth. They have no documentation of it. This is a corridor that was a brand new build. I believe it was around 2012. May have been just before. So here it is in 09, pre-build. Here it is in 2012 as a brand new build. You can see that it's got the two crosswalks are each separate. There's the angled buttons, and there's the lights that have the back-facing lights on the boulevard side. You can see them right there. Then they come along in 2017, changed these heads to have the lights only on one side, took out the angled buttons and patched the holes and put in one button in the middle, just to come back in 18, take out the one button, stack the buttons, and then have to change the overhead lights again to back-to-back lights. They only got to change about 20 intersections in 2017. So in 2018, most of them still had the double-facing lights and the stacked or angled buttons. But basically, they had to spend all of 2018 reversing all of the work that they had done in 2017. And here is the old example. This is 2007 of stacked buttons from the first time they were doing stacked buttons. So these are stacked. Now they're angled. Then they changed them back to stacked. And this corridor never actually got the double davit put in with the extra lights, which is what I say should have been the priority, is getting these back-to-back lights up on the boulevards. And they're spending so much effort and resources swapping these buttons around and swapping these heads around on existing ones that we can't seem to get around to upgrading the outdated ones that don't have boulevard lights, not to mention the side mount beacons. And we see the same problems now with moving the push buttons around. So on traffic signals. So here is Lage and Mint Place. You see how this push button's on the left side of the pole. In around 2017, they swapped it. Now it's on the right side. So again, here it is. This is Mint, the road going into the Mint. You can see here it's on the side facing that road. Now it's on the opposite side of the pole, and the holes are patched. And in the case of this one, Dublin and St. James, they've moved it twice. So here's the push button to cross St. James, and there's the push button to cross Dublin. You can see it's in the back of the pole. This is in 2012. In 2015, it's now moved to the front of the pole. So again, to cross Dublin, now it's in the front. And then in 2016, they went back and moved it back to its original. So to go over to 3 again, you can see here, it's on the back side of the pole away from St. James. Now it's on the front side facing St. James. Now it's back to the back side facing away from St. James. And when you go up later, it's gone entirely. Now it's only crossing St. James. And now what we see here is a corridor that was built as one unit, and the push buttons are in opposite place. The pole placement's opposite. You can see this pole is right up at the side of the road with the push button on it, while they put this one way off the road, necessitating a second redundant pole. And now here, this is Glasgow and Osborne. You can see starting off, now this is a major problem for accessibility issues. This is something I've been studying, is that there's no standardization of push button movement, push button placement, and there's been this constant movement. So here, this push button's kind of in the position where I'd argue it should be, which is right beside the opening to the crosswalk. Beside the crosswalk to the right of the pedestrian. So there's the push button originally. But you can see when they put the APS unit in, they put the APS over here on the wrong pole. And when you go back to 16, sorry, go back another year. Go back to 15, pre-APS, you can see there's just a push button on this pole here. Then they put so then it's this constant going back to the intersection. So then they come back in 16 and put the APS in on the wrong pole. So there's the APS unit there, the push button's here. Then in 17, they come and they add a second push button. Oh, sorry, I guess it's 18. 18, they come back and they add a second push button on the pole with the APS unit, basically correcting for their mistake by putting the APS on the wrong pole. So now we have a primary and a secondary push button, which just makes the push buttons that much more accessible, just for them to come back the next year again in 2020 and take the original push button completely out. And there it is gone. And here's an intersection where this was rebuilt in 2018. You can see they never had a boulevard push button. They add the boulevard push button and then put the pole way back behind the sidewalk, especially when there's deep snow. I don't know what that's supposed to do, but there's the push button and there's the sidewalk. It makes no sense. And that was a brand new build. And again, we see this pattern of pole moving. So here's a crosswalk. You can see here's the entrance to the crosswalk. The push button's on the right. Now, I know it was suggested by a council that I don't know how push buttons work or push button placement works, but I've actually spent hours and hours studying this, and I've read the standards. I'm very familiar with this. And here it is in 2018. This is Dominion and Sargent, and you can see entering this crosswalk, there's the push button right there on the right at the crosswalk, which seems like an absolute perfect, ideal placement for it. Then the street was renewed in 2020. They dug the pole out, moved it back for no apparent reason, moved this shaft pole up, and took the push button that was right beside the crosswalk is now over here on the back on this pole, on the back side of this pole here, behind the sidewalk. So if that's the way they want to do it, then you can't explain this one. Here's an intersection that had the push button that was exactly the way Dominion and Sargent was. The push button was on the back side of this pole in the exact same placement as this. The push button was right here. I'm going to try to go back a little, see if we can get a better angle. It's hard to get it with the limitations of Google. There, you can see the edge of the push button right there. So it's in the exact same placement as Dominion and Sargent. So if they change Dominion and Sargent from having it right beside the crosswalk to wanting it behind the sidewalk, well, maybe that's their standard. But yet they did the exact opposite here. They tore the push button off that pole, moved the davit up, moved this brand new davit, dug it out, moved it up, took the push button off this pole, moved it over to this one, and pulled it up to the corner, putting the push button right beside the entrance to the crosswalk, which would seem like an improvement, except over here at this corner, which already had the push button in the exact perfect placement, they did the exact opposite and moved it over behind the sidewalk onto the shaft pole, the exact way that this one started off. So again, it's this pattern of however it's built, they'll reverse it to the opposite, and we're not moving towards any pattern of consistency or standard. These two locations, it's the same placements of these poles. The push button should be in the consistent place, but they're just reversing them. So it's still inconsistent. It's just mirror images of how it was. And now we have this other issue of actuation refers to where the lights will often lie on what's called a resting green for the major road. So if a pedestrian wants to cross the major road, they have to push a button, or if a car wants to enter off the minor road, they'll sit on a sensor that will cause the light to cycle. Otherwise, the light will lie on a resting green. The opposite of actuated is fixed cycling, where the lights are just freely rotating, and that's especially common in the downtown area. There are no push buttons. Now, if you look here at, this is Agnes and Ellis. Here it is in 2009. You can see it's clearly an actuated location. There's the push button right there to cross Ellis Street. This is 2009. Around 2010, they took out the actuation and clearly converted it, they clearly converted it to a fixed cycle. And there it is. The push buttons are gone. They added the APS units, but the push buttons are completely gone. So now it's clearly operating as a fixed cycle with no push buttons to cross Ellis Street. Only for them to come back in 2020 during the renewal and put the push buttons back. And there they are. And they moved the poles up. And this seems to be the configuration that exactly how Dominion and Sargent was before they moved that pole back. So we saw an intersection that started off actuated, got converted to fixed, and then got converted back to actuated. Here's an intersection that's the exact opposite. This intersection started off fixed. You can see there's no push buttons. It got rebuilt in 2014 to 15. Push buttons were added on both roads, which really doesn't make a lot of sense. So here it is in 15. You can see push button here to cross St. Matthews, push button here to cross Empress. So these push buttons were freshly installed around 2015, only for them to come back in 2017 and remove, I have to jump up again, and remove the push buttons to cross St. James. And there you can see they're gone. They're only to cross Empress. So, and they did the same thing at Alice and St. James. And here's Grant and Roblin. You can see this is double push buttons to cross. This is a push button here to cross Roblin, and this is the push button here to cross Grant. This is 2015. 2017, they only have a push button to cross Grant, which would make sense. You can see there's the patch hole where it was to cross Roblin, only to come back a year later and put it back in. Now, Grosvenor and Harrow is another example. This intersection started off as being fixed cycling. There was no push buttons at it. Around 2013, they added pedestrian push buttons to cross Harrow. So clearly Harrow was the primary road in this case with the resting green. There it is in 2014 with the brand new push buttons, and they added wired underground to add these separate push button poles for cyclists. So they had to dig in sensor pads underneath Grosvenor to add the sensors for the cars, and they had to add these poles for the cyclists to push the button, and they added push buttons here for pedestrians. So this work was all done around 2013, only for them to come back in 2019 and take it all back out. There's the hole in the ground where the push button was for the cyclists. There's the one for that side, just an empty base. And the push button, the pedestrian push buttons are all gone. There's the patch there in that pole, and there's the patch in that pole. So you can see what they're continually doing is intersections that are fixed, they're converting them to actuated, and then they're converting them back to fixed, or vice versa. And in Corden, during the 2020 street renewal, they did the exact thing going down Corden. The ones that had push buttons had them removed. The ones that didn't have push buttons had them added. Another example would be McLeod and Gateway Road. I believe the push buttons there were added. McLeod and Raleigh is another one. So we'll use McLeod and Raleigh. McLeod and Gateway is the same deal. So here's McLeod and Raleigh in 2012, and you can see no push buttons, so clearly fixed cycling. Around 2012, they add APS and add push buttons for both roads. There it is.
Chris, Councillor Eadie's got his hand up.
Yep. Councillor Eadie?
Sorry, I had to find the unmute button. What a mess, Chris. Holy cow. With the push buttons, there is. So you probably have lots more intersections. Is the Raleigh one, that's for the active transportation trail, or is that?
Nope, there was no changes there. They added push buttons in 2012 and then removed them in 2018 at both of these.
At Raleigh?
Yeah, Raleigh and Gateway, yeah.
Gateway.
Well, Gateway I could see there's heavy. So the thing with push buttons, right? So usually the idea was you only use, you don't use push buttons to initiate audible signals. Only where they say there's predictable pedestrian traffic. So we convinced, because we don't like the push buttons, and neither do people who use wheelchairs and they're quadriplegic or whatever. Right? We were trying to get them to do, they do have devices nowadays that just when somebody pulls up there, it'll automatically go off. But the excuse they used is, well, if a dog goes by, it'll set it off. And so, well, too bad for the traffic, they can wait a little longer, right? Because really, when you're pushing the button, you're not really activating the audible signal. You're activating the length of time to get across, right, for a pedestrian. And the underground stuff for motor vehicles, that sets a timer off, just the regular timer, right? Yes. which is a lot less time than it takes for a pedestrian to get across. But anyway, what's interesting is when it comes to push buttons, now we had a big debate about it. That's why we said just get rid of them out of downtown, because every intersection has a different radius and where they locate the poles, because like you said, it has to be consistent. Now, the push button, all we could get was, it would be, a push button would be available, like if I'm on the left-hand side of the intersection, like Portage and Dominion is a good example. So, so I'm on the old motor vehicle side and I want to cross. So what they have is the push button is actually back at the where they put in a special guiding pole. It's the second intersection that ever got an audible signal. But so the push button should be on your left hand. You're on the left-hand side and you're crossing, right? The button should be at your left hand, right at the sidewalk, either before the cross sidewalk. So on Portage, I'm walking on Dominion. So when Portage crosses the sidewalk, So the button has to be on your left-hand side, either before that sidewalk or right where you stand and wait till the light changes and push the button there, right?
Yeah.
And that's how they're all supposed to be. So no matter, so if I'm over at the CNIB and I'm crossing on the RCMP side, from the CNIB over to the RCMP side, it still should be on my left. The push button at or near the curb. Now the problem is they told us, well, you know, we can't put a pole here, or we can't do this, or we can't do that. So, but it still has to be consistent. Like you said, the button needs to be placed like at pedestrian quarters. The button should be right there. You know, like I think it's 1.5 feet or whatever back, right? 2 feet maybe. Anyway, that's where the push button should be. And now they got the beeper things, but I don't know why they couldn't be consistent, because if you go to the universal design standards that the city set back in 2000, and I think they were finally in place in 2006, but traffic signals, I guess they don't write things down because like they know, well, and the ones who are graduating out of university, they should know how to properly install it. Like I don't get it, but when they use a push button, you know, that's it's usually, like you said, for cross. Harrow was the busy street or whatever, but like Dominion, I don't know what the predictable pedestrian traffic is though, right? So Dominion at Sargent might be a highly predictable place where you know there's pedestrians trying to get across Sargent. Like I don't know. And they're not supposed to use buttons. In that case, audible signals just should be automatically working.
Councillor Eady, not to cut you short, but
no, I'm just saying about. Anyway, I understand the coordinating different programs, but the push button thing is like, I can't believe they're so random on this. It's just ridiculous.
Well, the other issue that I'm primarily addressing, though, is this constant reversing whatever they do. So it's this make work of putting it in, taking it back out. I mean, if Gateway and Raleigh should be actuated, then it should be actuated. But they put in actuation, then they take it back out. And Harrow and Grosvenor, it's put it in 13, take it back out in 19. It's this constant in and out. And then even when they do maintain actuation, it's this putting the push button on this side of the pole, then putting it back on that side, then putting it back again. It's back and forth, or moving and swapping the poles. And no consistency.
There should be no push buttons at Grosvenor and in Stafford. Should be no push buttons. They wasted a lot of money. Well,
that's the point I'm making, is exactly that.
Well, Grosvenor's a highly predictable street, so is Stafford. Like, you got lots of pedestrian traffic around there. You got businesses and everything. Like, I don't understand the need for a push button. Anyway.
So here's the example of McLeod and Gateway. Here it is in 09. You can see there's only a push button here to cross McLeod. No push button to cross Gateway. They come in 2012 and add a push button to cross Gateway, only to come back in 18, and you can see the pole hasn't moved. Now all the push buttons are gone. Now, the other thing they do is some cases push buttons are added, they're not even needed. So in this case, this is one that really makes absolutely no sense. You can see this is a fully fixed intersection. There are no push buttons on this corner to cross here. Only the one corner, the northeast corner, had push buttons on both sides. So here's the push button to cross Arlington, and here's the push button to cross Notre Dame. But they're clearly completely redundant, because at the same time, in 2009, there are no push buttons here for any of the other crosswalks. Only the one pole on this one corner had 2 push buttons on it. It made no sense. They later just took them all out. And here's another example. These are redundant. This is a intersection that is Broadway and Langside. Now, clearly Broadway would be the major road, so you would have push buttons to cross Broadway, but they put in push buttons to also cross Langside. Now, this intersection has no turning arrows, so it doesn't appear that there'd be any reason to need push buttons to cross the minor road. The resting phase should be the walk cycle for the minor road. You shouldn't need a push button for that. It seems like they were actuating the APS systems originally, which really doesn't make sense, and then they just took it all out anyways. And the list is dozens upon dozens of intersections where they had these push buttons that they took out. They started taking these push buttons out around 2007. Here is Moray Street. You can see the push button there. And then it's gone. Another example of converting to fixed cycling. And this one's particularly interesting because this intersection, they started their project of taking out push buttons. It seemed to coincide with moving the APS down to being at the arm level instead of up at the pedestrian head. But at the same time, they were taking all these redundant buttons, but at the same time, they were also adding new ones. So this is Jefferson and Salter. This intersection wasn't yet signalized. This is 2012. They built it around 2013, and when they built it, they added push buttons on both to cross both Jefferson and to cross Salter. But this was the exact period when they were in the midst of removing all these redundant push buttons for crossing minor roads. So they put it in only to have to come back later and then take out the push buttons to cross Jefferson, just obviously making Salter a major road. But it doesn't make sense that they were installing these exact redundant push buttons on a new build that they were in the process of taking out at other locations.
Yeah, no, I lived at that corner, Chris. And yeah, that was bizarre. The push buttons are still there going to cross Salter, though. Yeah, I was just there. I was just down there the other day. I didn't know they had. Oh yeah, they did have the push buttons at the beginning, right? To cross Jefferson, which is well. Yeah.
It's
anyway. That's interesting. Yeah. Anyway, there's kids. There's a school there and stuff, so it should just automatically have the lengthier pedestrian crossing time. Anyway, whatever. Oh. And there's always lots of pedestrian crossing Salter. They shouldn't even have push buttons there.
Well,
no, because that's where you know where you know that there's going to be lots of pedestrians at various times of the day. There shouldn't be any push buttons.
Well, the other side of it is that if you don't have push buttons, that light has to operate in fixed cycling, and that would include 3 o'clock in the morning when there's no pedestrians, because we no longer use flash mode as of a year ago. So it's not necessarily just for when there's kids, but my work isn't so much about debating whether it should be fixed or it should be actuated. My work is to more so highlight this constant reversing of whatever they do.
But you're still promoting that we need to have a single standard for the whole city, right?
Exactly. That's my point. And
so then, yeah. So whether you're okay, all right.
Yeah, I'm not so much advocating one or the. I am in many cases, but my primary focus is to highlight their own contradictions.
Yeah. Councillor, it's you and I and Chris still on this call. Everyone else has had to leave. So if we could wrap this up, that would be.
Yeah. So, Chris, you probably got 1,000 more examples.
Yeah. Let's let Chris get through this, please.
All right. Okay.
We're good. We're almost there.
All right.
Yeah, because this has to go on YouTube still. Okay. Another thing they're doing is they were putting in secondary push buttons to help people come at the pole from either side. So you can see here, this pole has the push buttons on both sides. Well, a pedestrian coming from the north can hit the button for the corridor, or a pedestrian coming from the south. But then they went around and took out the secondary buttons at so many of these locations. So you can see here, it's gone. They did this at a lot of them. And the thing is again, why would you put them in if you're going to just take them back out? This is Plessis and Regent Avenue. You can see there's the one push button there. And here they added a secondary push button. So now it's on both of these poles. So, but while they're doing it at some locations, in the case of this one though, they actually had already had it originally. So if you go back, there it is in 2014, and there it is in the second poll in 2014.
Yeah, the interesting part is where they've got the button placement. There is no curved curbing there, so it's created actually a tripping hazard.
Yes, that too. But you can see how they have both buttons here in 16. There's one here and here. Then in 17, they take out this push button on this pole, only to have the one, just to go back a year later and then put it back. And in other locations, here they had the push button on both sides of the pole in 15, just to go in 16 and take one of them out. So it's just this constant pattern of putting in, taking out. And while at other locations, here's one that didn't have push buttons, they added 2 push buttons on both poles. While at other locations that had 2 push buttons, they take them out. Now, as another example of waste, up until 2017, they were adding these cyclist push buttons. And here they are yellow. You can see the push button for a cyclist across is yellow. They went around the whole city in 2017, other than a couple they missed, and changed them all to green. And I have an especially high appreciation for this changing of yellow buttons to green ones, which are less visible because they want cycling to represent being green while throwing out all of the yellow ones. It's so ironic to be throwing out something that's perfectly usable and fine and changing it because you want to make a color green for branding to represent being green. That irony of that just blows me away. Now, the last part of this, part 3, this presentation here, is accessible pedestrian signals, or APS. We've talked about it a fair bit. Originally, they were installing all of these speakers up by the pedestrian head level. Then they started taking them all out and converting them to little boxes further down. So that was Notre Dame and Weston, Maryland, Wolseley, and they started tearing all of these down. And they were putting in gray boxes that were further down on the pole. So here's the gray APS unit now down at a lower level of the pole. So they changed out all of these. They did a citywide mass change in 2016 to 17 of the last ones. Now they've also been moving the APS around. So you can see here's the APS units on this pole together. Then they split them and move it over to this pole. So again, if this pole was the ideal placement for the APS all along, then it should have just been installed there in the first place. But it's this constant putting it on one pole and then moving it to the other pole that we're seeing. And now this pattern of changing the APS on the side of the pole, you see how these APS units are facing towards the crosswalk. So they're parallel to the crosswalk. Starting around 2013, they started changing them all to be perpendicular. So they actually went around the whole city and took them off the pole, drilled new holes, and moved them 90 degrees so that they're facing perpendicular. So again, going back, the original installs were facing the crosswalk, parallel. Now they're all turned perpendicular. And they started doing this in around 2013. So anytime they're at an intersection working, they would take the APS units that are existing and rotate them. So again, you see here they are in the original position facing the crosswalk. And here they are turned 90 degrees. So that work began around 2013. Then by 2014, they started using yellow APS systems. So to go over the history of this intersection, let's go. Here it is pre-APS. Now they've got the APS and it's turned, so it's perpendicular. Then they come back in 16 to 17 and change it again. And now they're yellow. Now the department's reason for changing these is that yellow is more visible to partially sighted people. But what I can't understand is why that matters, because they're there to make noise. They're not there to be seen. And if yellow was better, they should have been yellow all along. And they only had APS at about half the city by when this changeout happened in 2016, it was just almost half the city had APS systems. So they actually halted installing APS systems at intersections that didn't have it at all, just to go back to all of the intersections they'd already put it in at to change all of those gray units to yellow. And this was done on a mass citywide basis. And it just doesn't make any sense because these APS units are, again, there to make noise. So here's the gray ones that they had just put in, and then they changed them out to yellow. Now, on top of that, they're installing redundant APS units. So we look at Albert Street here, where they've got no APS in 09. They install APS around 2011. Now you can see it's here facing the crosswalk, but it's redundant. This is fixed cycling. You don't need 2 APS units here. You only needed 1. By having installed a redundant APS unit, they doubled their cost. Then they rotated them and changed them to yellow. And again, they never needed 2 APS to begin with. So using the northwest corner as an example, here we are, 2009, no APS. We jump to 2012. Now we have 2 APS units, gray. Then they redo it, change them to 2 yellow APS units, again with the redundant one, just to come back later and then remove the redundant APS unit. So they never needed 2 to begin with. So they doubled their work all along by installing 2 gray ones, then installing 2 yellow ones, only to then salvage out the redundant one that they never needed in the first place. And we see this commonly. So using another example, Bannatyne, you can see 2 APS. Again, this is fixed cycling. We don't need it. And gray, and then we go to yellow, and they change them to stacking them on the pole instead of having them on those sides. So it's this these constant redundant APS units. And you look at, we'll use Broadway and Kennedy as a final example. You can see how these units are way away from the crosswalk. It shows the fluidity of where you place them. So this side of the corner has got 2 units. We only needed 1. This one only has the 1. And looking over on this corner, when they put the APS in, they put it on these 2 separate poles, again having the redundant one. Only to later come back and then combine them. So now they took the one off that was on this pole, is now removed, and put over here to this pole. And again, the pole never needed 2 to begin with. You never needed 2 at this corner. Just like this corner here only has 1. It's all you ever needed was 1. And the city is just polluted with these redundant APS units. Here, this corner got APS in 2015. So you go back, there's no APS. Oh, sorry, there's no APS there in 2012. I guess it got it in 14, so it never had the gray ones. Oh, no, it was 15. So there it is in 14 with no APS. They put the APS in 15. Now we have 1 APS unit, which is all we ever need, only to then come back in 16, add a redundant pole, and then put it, and then add a redundant APS. While the other one I showed earlier had the redundant at the beginning and then had it removed. It's back and forth. And now, as of around 2017, 2018, they started putting APS units on the boulevards, and I don't know why, but they're putting in 2. Again, it's redundant. You don't need 2. You only need 1 here above the boulevard push button because it's the same crosswalk. You only need 1 unit to give the sound for crossing. It's only a midway auditory sound. You don't need the 2. And this one was done in 2019. But this intersection was done the same time as part of the exact same project. It's just 2 intersections down. And this one does only have 1 on the boulevard. And then in 2021, this one also only has 1 on the boulevard. So they're random between whether they go 1 or 2. The department says they have to have 2, but they can't explain why so many of these ones only have 1. And lastly, they're also putting them in locations, APS onto the wrong poles. So I want to wrap up with this one. You do need 2 APS units when you have push buttons. Only when you have 2 push buttons, or sorry, only when you have push buttons, you need 2 APS units, because you only need 1 when it's fixed cycling, because 1 unit can alternate between servicing the 2 crossroads. But when you have a push button, you have to have 1 unit to give out what's called the locator tone, which is a constant pinging sound to attract or to draw people towards the push button. So that one has to continually give the locator tone while the other one serves the other crosswalk. But all these locations I showed with redundant APS units are actually fixed cycling locations, so you only needed 1. This is a location, though, that is actually actuated. It has push buttons, so it does need 2 APS units. But they've got them on this pole here. Here's where the push button is. So a visually impaired person looking for a push button is got the sound telling them to go to this pole to look for it, while the push button's over on this pole. Making the use of 2 APS units completely pointless, because all you're doing is putting out a locator tone to tell someone to go to the wrong pole. And we see this also throughout the city. I also touched on it at Osborne and Glasgow. So again, we're seeing this constant waste where they're putting in gray units that they don't, redundant gray units at locations of fixed cycling. Then they're tearing out all the gray ones to change them to yellow, while also turning them on the poles. And when they turn them on the poles, they often have to drill holes, and then that causes the poles to rust when they move the units to the other side of the pole and abandon these open holes that are drilled through the galvanization. So it's also aging the poles. So again, it's just part of this pattern of just constantly putting in, taking out, moving, and no set standard. And that is everything.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Eady, you have your hand up.
Yep.
Yeah, I was just trying to, so when you were talking about the speaker unit, right? Not the,
yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So are you saying they have 2 at one corner?
Yes.
On one pole?
Often on one pole, yes. Sometimes on 2 poles, but often on one pole, yes.
So like the new intersection they did at Seven Oaks and Main, although there's only 1 push button across at the
that one needs to have 2 units because it's actuated to cross Main. It has push buttons. So that
in the minute, if you get caught in the middle, there's a push button there, and you need a sound from that push button, right?
Oh yes, and that one only has 1 on the boulevard. That's proper, but some of them have 2. They're actually on the same pole on the boulevard.
I still trying to understand why they say they need 2.
I can't understand it either. And what I especially can't understand is why it's only half and half, whether they use 2 or 1. If they need 2, they need 2, but they only do it half the time.
Well, I could see where to locate a button. That's fine. But like you said, where do you go to find the button when there's 2? I don't know. Anyway, I don't know the intersections, so I wouldn't be able to look at it. But the thing about going from gray to yellow, right?
Mm-hmm.
So while I'm not involved with advocacy groups for people who are blind,
mm-hmm.
There is a group out there, and there's individual people who are blind, and it's never good when the city only consults with 1 person. They should be talking to a group, and we used to do that before they would do things. But so what's yellow are the speakers. You're telling me it's the speakers.
Yes.
So, well, what color are the push buttons?
They were originally green. Now they're yellow.
So they're both yellow now. Like some people do have enough vision to tell color, but they still need the audible signal. Okay.
Yeah.
But if the buttons are already yellow, I don't understand why the speaker, and where you don't need to push a button. Are you saying they turned them all yellow downtown?
Yep, all of them. And that's the thing I said to them too is...
Well, the audible's automatic. What do you need to know?
Well, yeah, there's no push button, but they changed the audibles themselves to become yellow. They were originally gray because they blended with the pole. their argument was it was to help visually impaired people find the pole. But why do visually impaired people care where the pole is when there's no push button on it? It doesn't matter. They don't care. And the pole could be anywhere in relation to the crosswalk.
Yeah, the only factor for people who are blind is that the sound comes from the pedestrian level, not from up top because sound drifts, right? So
yeah, and that's the exact.
Yeah.
If anything,
I'm glad I haven't had to try to use that. What intersection was that where you said there was 2 of them and they were on different poles?
That one was Bruce and Moray. Lydia, Notre Dame's another example. There's a few of them around.
Oh wow, that's just whacked. Weird. Okay. Anyway, very enlightening, I have to say, Chris.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So that's everything. Yeah, I'll do some summary examples at the budget meeting or finance meeting on Thursday. But yeah, you've seen pretty much everything I've studied now, at least by category.
Mm-hmm.
So,
again, appreciate your presentation. I'm going to try to work on this. I'm still at the office here, so I'm going to try to get these downloaded and split. So.
Okay, I will let you go. And I guess you might want to also maybe try and cut out some of like all this talking, there's no point in having this. And
It's tough to do the editing. I'm not a video editor, so I'll try to edit out what I can. Some of these questions presented by the councillors were good. It shows some engagement, and I appreciate the efforts of those that chose to attend tonight. So.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, I'll let you go for now then.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Thanks, Councillor Reedy.
Thank you. Bye for now.